Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking way past the shiny new products and those visionary CEOs to uncover the hidden structural forces that actually dictate an industry's profitability.
Okay, let's dive into this. Who really controls an industry's profits? Now, you might just assume the company making that final sale holds all the cards, right? But as we unpack the data today, you'll see that margin control is actually this constant dynamic battle. The power rarely sits exactly where you think it does.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. First, we'll meet the 5 forces. Second, we're focusing on the power of suppliers. Third, the drivers of supplier power. And finally, the impact on industry profitability.
So, Part 1. Meet the 5 forces. We are mapping the battlefield for profit.
And this brilliantly illustrates Michael Porter's famous 5 forces model. It's essentially a visual map of the battlefield. The sources describe these as pressure points, literally pushing in on a business from all sides. Right in the center, you have the competitive rivalry within the industry itself. But notice the outside forces pushing inward. You've got the threat of new entrants dropping in from above, substitute products creeping up from below, customers pushing from the right, and suppliers pushing in from the left.
These 5 primary forces act together. They form a composite that determines the entire competitive environment, and ultimately, they dictate the profit potential for any particular industry, measured in terms of long-run return on invested capital. As our sources point out, the really successful managers, they don't just react to this environment. They study these 5 forces to identify opportunities to favorably position their firm. But for our purposes today, we're going to zoom in and isolate just one of these pillars.
Which brings us to Part 2, focus on the power of suppliers. We are zooming in on the supply chain. Focus your attention specifically on that top arrow pressing down on the industry competitors. This is the bargaining power of suppliers. We're talking about the companies that provide the raw materials, the components, the equipment, the machinery, and even the labor necessary for an industry to function. This arrow represents their ability to exert real downward pressure onto the businesses they serve. So, what exactly is bargaining power? Well, it's simply a supplier's ability to influence terms in their own favor. They do this by charging higher prices, limiting quality or services, or just shifting their own costs straight onto the industry participants. I want you to think of this like a physical analogy. Suppliers are effectively squeezing the profits right out of an industry. To really visualize this squeeze, consider the mirror image of this force. Buyers, your customers, are constantly using their leverage to force your selling prices down. Meanwhile, your suppliers are using their leverage to force your input costs up. So the industry members just get trapped right in the middle of this vicious tug-of-war for margin. If you can't raise your prices because your buyers are powerful, but your costs keep rising because your suppliers are powerful, your profitability simply vanishes.
Moving on to Part 3, drivers of supplier power. What actually gives a supplier this kind of leverage?
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that supplier leverage isn't just about having an aggressive negotiating team. As the data shows, it's deeply rooted in the structural determinants of the market itself. The leverage a supplier holds is dictated by the economic realities and the structural setup of the industry they operate in. Let's break down exactly what those structural conditions are. Our sources highlight several key drivers here. First, if the supplier group is highly concentrated, meaning it's dominated by just a few large companies, they have immense power. They can essentially dictate the terms. Second, if demand is high and their products are in short supply, well, they inherently have pricing power. Third, and this is absolutely critical, if they provide highly differentiated or unique inputs, their power skyrockets. The sources give a great example of this. Pharmaceutical companies offering patented drugs with distinctive medical benefits. They hold massive power over hospitals simply because there are 0 alternatives. And fourth, if it costs the industry a ton of money or effort to switch from one supplier to another, that supplier can confidently raise prices knowing their customers are essentially locked in.
Let's move to and see how this builds under a few more specific conditions. First, a total lack of substitutes. Think about it. If you need titanium for a dental implant, you aren't negotiating aggressively because nothing else works. Next, suppliers are powerful when the industry they are selling to isn't a major customer. If they don't depend heavily on you for their total revenue, they won't hesitate for a second to extract maximum profits from you. Finally, there's the credible threat of forward integration. This just means the supplier could decide to enter your market and become your direct competitor if they don't like the terms you're offering. That threat alone is a massive check on your negotiating ability.
To really solidify this concept, look at this comparison. On one hand, you have weak suppliers.
These are folks selling basic commodities with plenty of available alternatives and low switching costs. In that scenario, the buyer holds all the cards. But on the other hand, consider a strong supplier scenario. The source material points to the personal computer industry over the past 30 years, where profits have historically been pretty dismal for the manufacturers. Why? Because of the immense power exercised by a highly concentrated supplier providing a unique, high switching cost product. Microsoft providing the operating systems.
Part 4. Impact on industry profitability. The final squeeze.
So the crucial point is that powerful suppliers absolutely must be viewed as a fundamental threat because they squeeze profits right out of an industry. When inputs account for a large proportion of your total costs, an industry is highly sensitive to whatever a supplier does. Take the airline industry, for example. When labor unions successfully organize, they act as very powerful suppliers of labor, driving up wages. And as anyone who has looked at airline profit margins knows, they rarely have extra cash to spare.
I really want to read this quote directly from the source text because it perfectly captures the stakes of this whole framework. Intense competitive pressures from just one of the 5 forces may suffice to destroy the conditions for good profitability. One strong force can be sufficient to keep average industry profitability low. Think about that for a second. You could have weak rivals, zero threat of new entrants, no substitutes, and pliant customers. But if your suppliers hold all the leverage, they alone will siphon away the value you create, leaving your business with a terrible return on investment.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer today. And back to you. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to analyze in your own daily work. Who holds the supplier power in your industry? And more importantly, knowing the structural drivers we just discussed, how exactly are they squeezing your margins right now? Take a hard look at your supply chain through the lens of Porter's 5 forces, and I guarantee you'll see your competitive environment in a completely new light. Keep learning, keep analyzing, and we'll see you next time on this explainer.